So this week, you're going to be developing your cover letter and resume. This is an area of kind of special interest for me. I guess interest is probably a strong word, but I've worked with resumes a lot. When I was working my PhD, I wrote resumes and cover letters and application materials for a job I had. It was a consulting job helping executives find new work, either leaving a post or looking for new work after they had been made to leave a post. And I've taught this again and again then in 113 or similar courses and seminars. So it's an area that I have a lot to say on, so this may be a longer presentation, though I will still try to be as concise as possible. And I will try to stick to what's in the text, not exactly, but relatively closely, so that you can review and have follow-up or additional support for what we talk about here in the text. As usual, you do need to read the text because I will likely not hit everything in the text, though this is a bit more detailed presentation possibly than my earlier ones. Looking at how do you develop an effective cover letter and resume, the first step comes in before you actually start writing the cover letter and resume. Now, I'll add a caveat to that. You probably want to have a template resume, a template cover letter ready to work with. In other words, you should have a resume that lists your job experience, that lists your skills, that lists your education, that has your references available on there, so that you have that document at hand, so that when you need to apply for a job, you are reworking an existing document rather than coming up with something from scratch all the time. And the same with the cover letter. So that's fine. But before you make an application, okay, you need to really think strategically about the job hunt. And this becomes part of that audience analysis we've been talking about. In other words, you're trying to decide who exactly is your target audience and then how best to approach them. So plan a job search strategy. Think carefully about how you're going to look for that position. And this will vary some from type industry to industry, but nearly every industry will have resources available to you to help you with your job hunt. And of course, you can go to Delta's Career Center and other places like it to get additional advice on how to plan your strategy. Focus your search as much as possible. In other words, if you're looking for a job in fast food, then think specifically about the kind of fast food you want to work in, and then do some research on the industry. Don't assume um, that there's nothing to know about the kind of work you're looking into or the work environments you'd like to look for or what they look for in somebody. If you're looking for a job in your field, this becomes even more important. What resumes look like, what people look for in resumes and cover letters, what people are looking for in candidates will vary from industry to industry. So this is key. Think about what kind of job you want and where you're going to apply to get that job, and then do some research on that. And when I say what kind of job and where you're going to apply, those are two different things potentially. I am a college professor, so yeah, my industry is college teaching, or that's my profession. But when I'm looking for work, if I'm applying to a two-year college, I prepare my application in one way. If I'm applying to a four-year college, I'll prepare my application another way, and I'll have to conduct research on those environments to see how they differ and how those applications need to be different. Okay. Your textbook lists some online sources. Career Center page should probably have online sources. Take advantage of those resources. For this cover letter and resume, you're finding a job to which you need to apply. You also need to do some research on the industry and the company. All of that stuff will find its way into your audience and purpose profile. I want to also see evidence of that in the cover letter and resume. Use the stuff you find to make an individual connection with the employer to whom you're applying. And this is just kind of a general, you can read this more carefully as I talk, or you can look at it in the text. Use the resources you have in terms of people in your life to get additional information. And this is called networking. If you have friends or have access to career counselors, recruiters, people who work in companies, then take advantage of those, but also use online resources. use Facebook and Twitter feeds and things like that to find out more about companies. A lot of times a company has a Facebook presence that will tell you something about it, a web presence that will tell you something about it. There may be individuals with whom you might be working who might have Twitter accounts that you can follow and get a feel for that environment. Of course, you're not going to do this for every single job you apply for, but if you're really looking at a company, if you live in Midland and you want to work for Dow, then you do this kind of legwork for that application, because I'll tell you what, a lot of people in Midland want to work for Dow. And a lot of people in your classes with you right now receiving the same training that you are receiving are going to be applying for the exact same jobs you'll be applying for. So how do you give yourself an edge? The resume is sort of your, Alannon describes it as your personal advertisement for employment. What it is it is an overview of what qualifies you for the job. So it's not your life story. It will include key relevant aspects of your life story, such as your education, such as your work experience, and such as relevant volunteer work or even hobbies if they're relevant to where you're applying, or if you need to show evidence of certain characteristics and traits early in your career that maybe those will reveal. But for the most part, your resume is going to focus on relevant information that applies to the workforce. And specifically, highlighted in your resume will be the relevant information that applies to the job to which you're applying. These things need to be neat looking, they need to be complete, but not packed. They need to be written in a style that's consistent with how resumes are supposed to be written. So not long, complete sentences, for example, but typically bulleted points. Sentence fragments we use usually in resumes, just statements of what you've done or what you've accomplished. And you cannot have mechanical errors in resumes or cover letters. These are short documents. If I get a resume and it's got proofing errors, then that tells me you're not a person who is meticulous or careful enough to get a short document like that right. There are basic parts to a resume. The order in which this appear will depend on the kind of resume that you are writing. A few things to keep off of the resume. Don't mention your desired salary. If they ask for it, then you're going to have to mention it. But I will tell you that oftentimes desired salary is the thing that will not get you the interview. So you want to think about that very carefully. Anything else you want as part of the job package, leave off the resume. The resume is not a place to negotiate, or the cover letter for that matter. The application materials are not the place where you negotiate things you want once you get hired. At this point, you are making a pitch for yourself. There's nothing unethical in not mentioning in an application, for example, that you need a month off in January because you're going through some medical procedures. In the hiring process, that would need to come up, but there's nothing wrong with not telling people that as you're applying for the job. You would want as the process, at least not in this early stage, you would want as the process progresses to let them know in case that's going to be a deal breaker for them. You don't want them to invest too much in hiring you, but certainly the cover letter and resume are not the place to make that initial mention of that. Your contact information should include current and accurate information for contacting you. Your email address needs to be professional and appropriate. It should include your name. Okay, so fuzzybunny@aol.com, if anyone still uses aol.com, fuzzybunny@yahoo.com, let's go with that, would not be appropriate even if that's your email address. Create an email address that is your job application, professional correspondence email address, and that needs to have your name in it. And depending on how common your name is, it may be your name and some random numbers or something like that, that's fine. But it cannot be some weird nickname that is something that maybe works fine when you're posting online or communicating with friends and family. It's not appropriate for your resume or for professional correspondence. Your career objectives should spell out the kind of job you want, but it needs to be tailored a little bit to any job you apply for. Don't be overly vague, but also don't be overly specific. Okay? In other words, you don't want to say, I want a job at McDonald's doing this, but you want your your career objective to be specific enough that McDonald's fits into it. And here's an example. This is somebody who wants to do customer relations in a hotel chain or something like that with the hope of being a manager later on. So if they apply to Hilton, Okay, they're not going to mention Hilton in their career objective, but this career objective, customer relations for a hospitality chain leading to management, is specific enough that it will apply to that Hilton job. So not too specific and not long and wordy. Keep this concise. This is a useful thing to kind of introduce the resume, to let your the high people who you hope to hire you to see how you might fit into their organization, but it is not worth giving up a huge chunk of your resume to. Education is an important section. You always begin with your most recent education and then work your way back. You do not usually include high school once you've got college education. It's assumed you have your high school education if you've taken college courses. So if you're here at Delta now, do not include your high school experience unless there's something special about it. You will typically, if it's good, include your class rank and your GPA, things like that. Look in the book for models of what the details should look like. For all of this, look in the text for models of what this stuff needs to look like. You may also want to include additional relevant material such as coursework, clinicals work, things like that if they apply to the job to which you're applying. Certifications earned at the end of education, whatever. So again, keep this in mind. We're going to talk about where this goes in the resume in a bit. Your work experience begins with your most recent job and works its way backwards. Okay, and again, what you include in there, it's listed here, but also look for that in the textbook. It's outlined there. Describe your duties in the job and promotions, and use active verbs for this. Okay, typically you begin your sentence with the verb. Managed cash register for a chain that had 200 customers a night. That's a really bad one, but I made it up off the top of my head, so I guess it's not that terrible. And also include key accomplishments if those are relevant. Okay. Personal data and interests, if you've got awards, skills, activities, memberships, all that are relevant, then you include them. And this is why the generic resume will have all of this stuff, but when you apply to a specific job, if this looks like padding, pull it out. Okay, and don't try to squeeze it in by making some justification. Well, the fact that I am a professional bungee jumper shows that I am able to overcome my fears, and therefore I would make a great manager at McDonald's someday. I mean, that's a real stretch. You can in your mind glue those things together, but then the mind can deceive itself. So be really careful about trying to shoehorn this stuff in. References, whether you include these on the resume or not, varies somewhat. You can just write references available on request. That's perfectly fine, and then provide a separate reference list. A lot of times the job application that you will also oftentimes fill out in addition to sending in your resume might ask for a separate reference list. But if not, keep the references on here. And they should be professional references as early on as possible. You don't want your mom as your reference. 2 organizations for resumes, and you've got to pay attention to this because this is key, especially if you are applying for a job in your career field that you don't have experience in yet. Okay, the reverse chronological resume focuses on the job experience. It begins with your latest job and works its way backwards, and then because your education usually comes early in your career, before your career, the education comes last in the resume. When do you use this? Well, when that job, the last job you've had or the last few jobs you've had, are going to offer evidence of your qualifications. So if you've got experience in the field to which you're applying, or if you've made a strong case connecting your experience to what's in the field, if your primary selling point for your qualifications is your experience, then you use the reverse chronological resume. If it is not, then use the functional resume. This focuses on skills. Okay, so it will begin typically with a skills section that lists the things that you can do. So if you've recently been trained in a lot of technologies you've not yet worked on, you can list those as technologies with which you're familiar in the skills section. Okay, so that's important. Oftentimes your education then comes next because oftentimes the education is where you've developed those skills if you haven't used them in the workplace yet. And this is where you may want to include relevant training, coursework that you did especially well in, clinical work, um, uh, what do you call them? Like career placements, internships, things like that that shore up your qualifications. And this does indicate, as you're thinking about this resume while you're still in school, think about these sorts of opportunities. What things can you do, even volunteering, for example? My wife recently got a position. Most of the skills for which she got the job, she demonstrated in volunteer work. She had worked in a different field when she was working, and then she'd taken some time off work when my son was little. And so she went in with volunteer because she kept very busy even when she wasn't earning a living. And we put together a functional resume for her that highlighted that experience in her education and those sorts of relevant skills. And that got her in for the interview. And that's all you're doing at this point is you're getting yourself in for the interview. And then you can sell yourself once you're in the interview. Okay. The functional resume is also good if you've got gaps in employment. You can't hide gaps in employment. You can't leave dates off your work experience if you want to try to avoid admitting that you were out of work for a while. But the functional resume at least puts emphasis on what you can do for them before highlighting deficits. And before I hit these guidelines, you can combine functional and chronological. In other words, you can do a chronological resume that begins with a skills section, and you will see that fairly frequently. So you can do these hybrid resumes as well. Basic guidelines for writing your resume. Write your resume before your job search, have that template ready. Tailor it for each job. Never send out a generic resume to every job, especially if they're jobs that you really want. If you're like, you've got a reasonably good, you've worked as a server for a long time, you've got a good resume for being a server, and you just want to apply at every restaurant in town, okay, well, that's fine. But if there's a restaurant you really want to work at, or if there's a job ad that you're applying to that might, for example, be management experience or whatever, take your time to tailor the resume, revise it so it highlights things you've done that match that job ad or match that work environment. Try to limit the resume to a single page, but 2 pages is better if it's getting cramped and cluttered looking. Okay, so and you do not want to mess with fonts and margins to try to squeeze things onto a single page. If you can provide your information and it's just over a page, try to edit things out. Otherwise, you may think of trying to do a 2-page resume. Focus on experience that's relevant to the job. Use action verbs and keywords. Action verbs, you begin with the sentence with a verb that shows you doing something. You don't say responsible for, which is the lamest thing ever in a resume, right? Responsible for managing money. No, managed money. That shows the person reading the resume what you did, right? It lets you vary the language by using different verbs for different things. It's really incredibly powerful. And then keywords. And keywords are important, especially we'll talk about in just a bit for electronic resumes. Keywords that match what the person who is reviewing the resume is going to know about the job. So compare your resume to the job ad, and when possible, use the language in the ad in the resume. The person who first looks at your resume may know nothing about the job at all other than what he or she has in the job ad if it's an HR person. So the keywords are really crucial. Okay, and then use the visual stuff thoughtfully for emphasis. Don't leave it out, don't overdo it. And again, look at the models in your text on that show how to do that really well, or look at models online. There's some great models online. Never invent or skew things. You get caught when you still have to be interviewed and you still have to work. So if you pretend you've done things you haven't done, it's going to come out. Use decent paper. You don't have to use really expensive stuff, but use decent paper, decent envelopes, and again, be sure there are no errors on either the cover letter or the resume. Electronic resumes, I'm not going to go over these slides carefully, but I want you to look at these in your text. What I want you to be aware of is the fact that resumes are oftentimes submitted directly online, or if even you submit them on paper, they're scanned in and they go into a database which is searchable. So read through the stuff in the text on electronic resumes. Make sure your resumes are designed in such a way that they're searchable. So for example, if you have programming skills, you can write programming skills great, but you're going to want to identify the specific languages you programmed in, because and I've done this as a living, I worked for a computer consulting company that we subcontracted IT people, If I search for C++, if C++ isn't on your resume is not going to pop up in my search. So you can say program lots of languages. Yeah, gnarly. That's great. You can do that. But your resume is not going to get you looked at again if I'm going to the database and just plugging search terms into a field. So just be aware of that. The application letter, what I've been calling the cover letter, this is a complement to the resume. It's mainly aimed at making the connection between your resume and the specific job that you're applying to, and the tone of it and the way you put it together can also give your reader a sense of who you are as a person that doesn't come across in a resume. So the slide here says an informed, professional, likable applicant. So it presents you as a person. This is one of the reasons you want to avoid too much standardized blah blah language in an application letter, because it defeats the purpose. You should not just throw together a cover letter that says, here's my resume, because you know you need a cover letter and you have no idea what to do with it. That does nothing for you. It's completely useless. You have two types of application letters. One is solicited, one is unsolicited. Solicited, you're applying for a job ad. Unsolicited, you want to work someplace, and you think there might be a place for you in that company, but even if you don't, you just know you want to work there, so you want to prepare an application process package for that company. The solicited is fairly straightforward. In the intro, you always begin with the job and where you saw it advertised. Both of those are important. Here's a position that I saw advertised here. Employers like to know where you saw it advertised because it helps them decide where to spend their advertising money. Okay, and name the job right away, because that employer might have multiple jobs out there, and some might even be fairly similar to each other. Briefly identify yourself and your background. I am a so-and-so with background in blah, blah. And if there's anything that connects you to the company, you mention that in the introduction. Okay, especially if there's somebody, my Uncle Ted has worked in this company for years. Now, don't say that implying that because Uncle Ted works there, you should hire me, but use that as evidence of what you know about the company. Uncle Ted has worked there for a number of years, and he's always been impressed with the efficiency with which your organization is run, blah, blah, blah. The body spells out your case without just repeating the resume. Okay, keep it focused on the main qualifications to the advertised job. So you will pull information that might be stated in your resume. You may be stating it here as well, but you'll state it differently, and you don't pull everything out, right? You make the connection specifically with this job. What is it that makes you a great applicant for this job? And then the final paragraph, a brief conclusion, just restates your interest and then requests action. Don't be too aggressive with this. I know I'm the best candidate, and I expect I'll be hearing from you soon. That's not appropriate. But I would very much enjoy discussing my qualifications in greater depth in an interview. You can reach me and then give them your preferred contact information. Yes, you've got your contact information on your resume, but what do you prefer? Or are there times of day that you need to be reached? Employers understand, especially if you're working already, that you may have constraints on when they can call you. Unsolicited application letters are tough. They're making a pitch to somebody who might not be hiring or may not have thought of hiring someone like you. So in the intro, you can't just say, I'm looking for a job as a blah blah in your organization. You've got to really make this dynamic and engaging and try to make a strong connection. The example here has you asking a persuasive question or making a strong statement, something that makes you stand apart. Now, again, you don't want to come across as arrogant. You don't want to overstate your abilities, okay? But think of the type of hook you would use in a 111 or a composition essay. You need that kind of hook in your unsolicited application letter, because most of these, to be honest, are going to be opened and shredded, or they might be opened and scanned in and filed away, but they're not looked at very carefully. So think of how you can catch someone's attention. The body should relate your qualifications to the type of job you'd like to obtain. This is where your research comes in for both cover letters, right? You need to know what qualifications to emphasize. How do you know that? You conduct research on the job and you conduct research on the company, and you make that connection. And this can come down to looking into the value statements of a company. If a company states that they hold a certain value, in your cover letter you can say, I too hold that value. On your website, I saw that one of your values is diversity. I've always been personally committed to diversity, and in fact I volunteered for blah 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 group. Okay? The body does that. The conclusion restates your interest and then requests action. A phone call. I'd love to talk to you on the phone, or if I might have an informal interview, whatever. Again, you've got to be gentle with this because they've not made time in their day to hire for this position, but you don't want to just leave it hanging. Okay, propose something to follow up. And again, these are a long shot, but they're worth taking your time on because if you have any hope of getting looked at, you've got to have an excellent letter and an excellent resume. Okay, just a quick guidelines and then we're done with this. First of all, make sure you've got a very strong prototype letter. Just like with a resume, you want to have a very detailed kind of template. You can pull stuff out and rework that, and that's what the second point is. You can customize it for each opening, and you have to do that. Okay, and you may find you're applying for jobs that are very similar. If I'm applying for a comp teacher job, there'll be relatively minor changes to my cover letter, probably depending on the job. But I look at each single cover letter, and I look at the job, and I look at the institution, and see where I can make some sort of individual one-on-one connection. Be very careful when you're adapting sample letters from online or from a book. In fact, I try to avoid it. Look at them as models for how it should look and sound, but use completely your own language. Case with resumes too, and be very hesitant. For week one, I've told you can use the word template to create a resume, just to have a resume. But the fonts and format in the word template are sometimes very difficult to read. So if you've used the word template, you want to not necessarily use that resume as the one you send out. It's a great, easy way to gather the information you need, but you want to make sure that that resume looks like your resume and is easy to read, easy to follow, and the same is the case with the cover letter. Be dynamic in your tone. Sound like a real person. Sound lively. Be professional. Don't be too slangy, too casual. Don't use emoticons and things like that that you might use in an email. Emoticons are largely verboten. Now, you don't want to include them in most workplace correspondence unless you've got a very informal workplace, and then only in more informal communications like email or texting. Okay. Um, don't be vague. Don't exaggerate. Sound enthusiastic, and don't brown nose. Don't be so enthusiastic about the company or the person to whom you're applying that it comes across as artificial or false. Okay, because it will work against you. Be concise. This should be a page long, and it doesn't have to be a full page. Concise does not mean short, however. And if you need to include a little more information to make your case, then include it. And concise will vary from job to job. My concise cover letter is almost 2 full pages long because that's what we do in academia. Okay, academia is looking for a certain level of detail on what you've done and your teaching theory, the courses you've taught, the methodologies you've used. They want that in there. Okay, never ever settle for your first draft. Always revise, set it aside, revise, set it aside, revise. Have someone else look at it, and never send a photocopied letter. Print up each letter and resume, unless you've got a very good copy place that's copied off your resume. If you send a photocopied letter, especially though, people understand your resumes are going to not change a lot from job to job, at least in the same industry. But people expect you to take a personal approach to them with that cover letter. Okay, this has been a very long presentation. I apologize for that. That's actually not great pedagogy, but I wanted to give you all of this information. It's an area, like I said, I know something about, and it is the heart of this. This is what you're preparing for this very first assignment. Do read the text very carefully. Look at the models in the text, and then apply those accordingly.